By 2024, Canada had directed more than three-quarters of all its merchandise exports to a single partner, the United States. This level of dependency had become a structural reality of the national economy rather than a deliberate policy. That dependency is now showing signs of strain, and what follows traces how it was established, why it went largely unquestioned, and how a single year of trade conflict accelerated a reckoning decades in the making. The architecture of economic integration between Canada and the United States developed incrementally. Since 1989, trade between the two nations was governed by a series of agreements. First came the Canada-United States Free Trade Agreement, followed by the 1994 North American Free Trade Agreement, and eventually the 2020 United States-Mexico-Canada Agreement. Each treaty removed additional barriers, making trade deeper, more profitable, and progressively harder to reverse. The natural path of growth was always toward the south. The outcomes were historically remarkable. Following the Canada-United States Free Trade Agreement in 1989, trade surged dramatically, and NAFTA's implementation in 1994 accelerated the trend further. By 2018, Canadian merchandise exports to the United States reached $438.3 billion, a fourfold increase from $101.6 billion in 1989. For a nation of Canada's size, this expansion was more than economic success. It represented economic capture. By 2024, over three-quarters of Canadian exports went to the United States, while nearly half of Canadian imports came from there. By comparison, the European Union directed roughly 20% of its exports to the United States. Canada's ratio was nearly 4 times higher than that. No other G7 economy approached this degree of single customer reliance. Canada had effectively become a supplier subsidiary of the American economy without ever officially acknowledging it. The political economy of this arrangement was compelling. When one trade relationship dominates a country's production, the industries serving that relationship grow large, profitable, and politically influential. Canadian auto manufacturers, steel and lumber companies, and energy exporters structured their supply chains around American demand. Their lobbying agendas, workforce planning, and investment cycles all aligned with the rhythms of the U.S. market. This created constituencies inherently resistant to trade diversification because diversifying meant short-term disruption. A canola farmer accustomed to selling in the United States for decades had no established networks in Jakarta or Nairobi. Diversification was not only logistically challenging, but organizationally foreign. The auto sector illustrated this dependency clearly. At the time, tariffs were imposed. 68.3% of Canadian auto manufacturing jobs were tied to U.S. exports, reflecting decades of open trade that fused Canadian production into a single continental supply chain. These supply chains were not merely flows of goods. They involved physical infrastructure, assembly lines, parts networks, and just-in-time logistics crossing the border, sometimes multiple times, for a single component. Disentangling these relationships would take years and billions of dollars. Some 2 million Canadian jobs depended on exports to the United States. That figure, provided by the Bank of Canada, shows the scale at stake when the Trump administration began weaponizing trade. 2 million jobs equaled roughly 10% of Canada's entire workforce. No country can expose 10% of its employment to unilateral foreign decisions and still claim economic sovereignty. The shock arrived swiftly. On February 1st, 2025, President Trump announced sweeping tariffs on Canadian goods, including a 25% tariff on most imports and a 10% tariff on Canadian energy products. Canada retaliated with tariffs on $30 billion worth of U.S. goods, escalating to $155 billion after 3 weeks. These were not routine disputes. They fundamentally challenged a framework governing continental trade for over 3 decades. By October 2025, Canadian goods faced tariffs as high as 35%. While Canada imposed matching levies, sectoral damage was immediate and concentrated. With 82% of Canadian motor vehicle production exported to the U.S., the auto sector was highly vulnerable. Motor vehicles and parts experienced a real GDP decline, averaging 1.6% to 6% year over year from January through November 2025, with an estimated loss of 6,887 jobs, 6,214 of them in parts manufacturing. Steel and aluminum suffered even more, with tariffs doubling to 50% and combined exports in 2025 falling faster than during the 2018 tariff episode. Canada's manufacturing sector entered a period of contraction. Between January and September 2025, output declined, employment weakened, and prices increased. Job losses accelerated during the spring. In April alone, 30,600 manufacturing positions were eliminated. May brought another 12,200 losses. The impact was concentrated in specific regions. Manufacturing centers across Ontario continued to experience weaker trade performance. Oshawa, London, and Kitchener-Cambridge-Waterloo displayed some of the most visible indicators of trade-related economic pressure. These areas remained heavily dependent on the United States market while showing limited progress toward diversification. By December 2025, payroll employment across Canadian manufacturing stood at slightly more than 1.5 million workers. That represented a decline of 40,600 compared with December 2024. Transportation equipment manufacturing lost 9,300 jobs. Machinery manufacturing shed 3,600 positions. Fabricated metal products recorded an additional loss of 3,500 jobs. These reductions were documented and significant. Their effects were not evenly shared. Immigrant workers faced a disproportionate burden, accounting for 30% of manufacturing employment in March 2025, and becoming especially vulnerable as tariff pressures destabilized the sector. The political response emerged in April 2025 with the election of Mark Carney. The former central banker entered public office promoting economic sovereignty and expanded trade diversification. The federal budget for 2025 established a target of doubling exports of goods and services to markets outside the United States during the following decade, aiming for $600 billion by 2035. To support that objective, the budget allocated $5 billion toward trade infrastructure projects. Export Development Canada was also expected to expand the volume of business it facilitates by $25 billion by 2030. The scale of the objective was substantial, doubling non-U.S. exports within 10 years represented a structural transformation rarely achieved in a short period. Canada's trade system, including pipelines, ports, rail terminals, cold storage networks, and financial mechanisms supporting exports, had been oriented overwhelmingly toward the south. Redirecting that system required infrastructure that was not yet in place, regulatory arrangements that remained unfinished, and commercial relationships that had not been fully developed. During his first year in office, Carney made 26 international trips. Only one new trade agreement was formally concluded, with Indonesia, and it had not yet received ratification. Exports to the United States declined by approximately 16% year over year during 2025. At the same time, exports to destinations outside the United States increased. Diplomatic engagement expanded, though the outcomes remained incomplete. Asia offered some of the strongest long-term opportunities. The Indo-Pacific region ranked as Canada's second-largest trading partner, accounting for more than $260 billion in two-way merchandise trade. Despite that scale, it represented only 10% of Canadian exports. The disparity highlighted the imbalance created through decades of integration with the United States. The Indo-Pacific market was large, expanding, and in demand for many products Canada already produced. These included energy resources, agricultural commodities, critical minerals, and wood products. However, Canadian exporters had not developed the shipping capacity or port infrastructure necessary to serve those markets on a large scale. The most significant step in Canada's diversification effort occurred in January 2026. Prime Minister Carney traveled to Beijing, marking the first visit by a Canadian Prime Minister to China in nearly a decade. During the visit, he announced a new strategic partnership with President Xi Jinping focused on energy, clean technology, agri-food industries, and trade. The development carried both economic and geopolitical significance. Canada and China had been engaged in their own trade dispute since 2024, when Canada adopted measures similar to those of the United States by imposing a 100% tariff on Chinese electric vehicles. China responded with major tariffs targeting Canadian rapeseed, oil, peas, and pork, focusing specifically on agricultural exports from Western Canada. The January 2026 agreement resolved much of that bilateral dispute, while also advancing Canada's broader objective of reducing reliance on the United States. The arrangement included lower tariffs on Canadian agricultural exports, provisions allowing up to 49,000 Chinese electric vehicles to enter under a 6.1% tariff, and joint investment programs involving clean energy, technology, and manufacturing. These measures were projected to generate nearly $3 billion in additional exports. For agriculture, the benefits appeared immediately. Duties on canola seed were reduced from 84% to a combined rate of roughly 15% by March 1, 2026. Canola meal, lobster, crab, and peas were exempted from anti-discrimination tariffs through the end of 2026. The reduction in tariffs was expected to restore access to a canola seed market valued at approximately $4 billion annually. The premiers of British Columbia, Alberta, and Saskatchewan expressed an unusually broad consensus in support of the agreement. They viewed it as an important step toward long-delayed diversification of agri-food, lumber, and energy exports into Asian markets. At a moment when excessive dependence on the United States was increasingly viewed as a strategic vulnerability, Alberta and British Columbia were not natural political allies. The fact that both British Columbia and Alberta supported the shift toward China at the same time demonstrated how strongly dependence on the United States had begun to hurt. The trade diversification figures from 2025 showed meaningful gains but also clear constraints. Canada successfully redirected approximately 25% to 30% of exports that had previously been destined for the United States toward other international markets, particularly across Europe and Asia. Exports to Europe increased by 22% compared with 2024. Shipments to Africa rose by 18%. Exports to Central and South America advanced by 11%. Even so, only 25% to 30% of the export volume lost in the U.S. market was replaced through alternative destinations. The remaining 70% to 75% was either lost entirely, pushed into lower pricing, or absorbed through domestic consumption where possible. Exports to non-U.S. markets grew by 16.8% nationwide between 2024 and 2025. However, the number of Canadian exporters selling outside the United States increased by only 6% year over year. Although fewer companies reported taking no action than in the previous year, only a limited number were actively expanding sales channels or supplier networks beyond the American market. Most diversification activity came from large exporters that already operated internationally and were extending their reach further. Small and medium-sized businesses, which formed the core of supply chains integrated with the United States, played a much smaller role. Many lacked the financial resources, business connections, and product offerings required to compete effectively in non-U.S. markets. Public support for diversification emerged with a level of spontaneity that surprised even those promoting it. The boycott of American goods during 2025 and 2026 began on February 1st, 2025. It was driven by President Trump's tariff threats and his remarks suggesting that Canada could become the 51st state. The movement sought to strengthen domestic production, increase local consumption, and encourage trade among Canadian provinces. Consumer choices became an instrument of foreign policy. The number of Canadians returning from the United States declined by 25% year over year during 2025. At the same time, travel within Canada and to destinations outside the United States increased significantly. Provincial governments removed American alcohol products from liquor stores. Procurement policies at both federal and provincial levels were increasingly shaped around Canadian-focused priorities. The IMF estimated that removing interprovincial trade barriers could raise Canadian GDP by 7%. While some minor federal restrictions were eliminated, provincial action remained largely symbolic rather than transformative. The Carney government was unwilling to spend significant political capital to force faster movement. This remained a long-standing weakness within Canada's economic system. In many product categories, Canadian provinces traded more freely with the United States than with one another. A country unable to move beer easily across its own provincial borders was not fully prepared to redirect itself toward global markets. The comparison with Europe remained striking. The European Union depended on the United States for slightly more than 20% of its merchandise exports. Canada still sent close to 70% of its exports south. That difference, 70% compared with 20%, became the defining measure of Canada's economic exposure. Reducing that gap by even half would require years of policy commitment, major infrastructure spending, and the development of commercial partnerships across many markets. Canada already possessed 15 free trade agreements covering 51 countries. Together, they provided access to 61% of global GDP and 1.5 billion consumers. The treaty framework was already in place. What had been absent were the commercial networks, export infrastructure, and political urgency necessary to make full use of those agreements. Trump's tariffs supplied that urgency. In July 2026, the United States, Canada, and Mexico were scheduled to begin a review of the United States-Mexico-Canada agreement. That review carried the potential for substantial changes and would become a critical test. If Canada entered the negotiations still overwhelmingly dependent on the United States, it would bargain from the same position of weakness that had long defined the relationship. If diversification efforts had begun producing measurable results, if Asian markets were purchasing larger volumes of Canadian energy, and if the agreement with China was generating meaningful export growth, Canada would approach negotiations with at least somewhat less reliance on American goodwill. The tariff shock revealed more than an economic weakness. It exposed a failure of perception. Canada had repeatedly received warnings from credible voices that dependence on a single export destination carried significant risks. Those warnings were acknowledged, documented, and ultimately disregarded. The structure of the integrated North American economy made diversification appear unnecessary. Yet governments rarely accept short-term costs without a compelling reason. Necessity became that reason. Trump created the necessity. The trade conflict caused economic damage. At the same time, it forced a reassessment. In January 2026, Canada took steps toward Beijing, toward ASEAN capitals, and toward a trading framework less centered on the United States. Previously, those moves had been viewed as too expensive or simply unnecessary. The transition remained unfinished. It was imperfect and generated domestic debate. Concerns surrounding Chinese investment and national security persisted without resolution. The government's strong diplomatic focus on Europe also attracted criticism. Nevertheless, a direction had been established. That direction moved away from the United States. It was deliberate. It carried consequences. And for the first time in 30 years, it was driven by urgency rather than convenience. For an entire generation, a single customer had absorbed much of Canada's economic output and shaped the limits of its economic independence. The events of 2025 and 2026 marked the beginning of an effort to change that reality. If you found this analysis valuable, share your thoughts, follow for more in-depth geopolitical and economic coverage, and stay tuned for the next report. Please leave your thoughts about this content in the comments below. Thanks for watching. See you in the next one.